Thank you.
You're very welcome. Cathaoirleach, I welcome the opportunity to speak on this important piece of legislation, and I commend the Minister and indeed the Department of Health for bringing forward this legislation. I know this is legislation that is long overdue. I know it is legislation that has been called for and that has been required for over 2 decades now, but I think we do need to appreciate that it is very complex and complicated legislation, and notwithstanding the delay, I can understand why the Minister and the Department have had to put such time into preparing this legislation. When you read through it, you can see that it deals with areas of such enormous complexity, of ethical issues of significant concern, and it is important that we get the balance right when we enact this legislation. I think also this legislation will benefit from having everyone in this House considering it. All parties in the House will have an opportunity to review it. I know it's complicated legislation, but I think the Department of Health will benefit from getting the views of very many members of this House. Cathaoirleach, I think it was back in July 1978 that the first child conceived through IVF was born. That was an extraordinary scientific achievement. It transformed the world in very many ways, but in particular it transformed the lives of very many people who couldn't have children up to then, and because of scientific change were then subsequently able to have children. It was a remarkable achievement, and over the past 40 years in Ireland and indeed throughout the world, very many couples have been assisted in reproducing children as a result of assisted human reproduction processes. It is surprising when you look at it in Ireland that to date we've never had it regulated by law, we've never had it licensed by law. Notwithstanding that, it obviously is the case that very many couples in Ireland over the past 20, 30 years have availed of the services of providers of services in respect of assisted human reproduction. Even though those services seem to have been provided without too much controversy or without too much public criticism, I think it is the case that it is absolutely essential that this issue is regulated by the houses of the Oireachtas. When we look back at some of the issues that have arisen in respect of assisted human reproduction, and in particular in respect of IVF, we can see the problems that have arisen in the past as a result of the absence of legislation. For instance, in 2009, the Supreme Court considered a case that arose as a result of a couple who decided to go down the avenue of in vitro fertilization. They had a number of embryos produced. Some of them were implanted in the woman, others were frozen. Subsequently, the couple separated and split up. And there was a very traumatic case that arose as a result of the fact that, in respect to the frozen embryos, the woman in the relationship, subsequently after the separation, wanted them implanted and born, whereas the man didn't want that to happen. And that was an extremely difficult issue to be resolved. And it would have been resolved if there was legislation in place saying what should be done in circumstances like that. Ultimately, the matter went to the Supreme Court, and it was resolved in a manner, though, that wasn't, in my opinion, satisfactory, because there was the absence of legislation, and the couple shouldn't have been put through the trauma and the uncertainty of not knowing what would occur. For instance, we now know, Minister, under the draft legislation that's been introduced, the bill that I think it is under Section 23, that the issue that arose in that case wouldn't apply now, because there's the procedure available for one of the parents under Section 23 to apply for a revocation of permission that they previously granted. So we know how that traumatic situation would be dealt with. I think it's also important to note that the persons who are providing these services in Ireland at present, they also want to be regulated. It's important that they are regulated. And I think that's why I welcome the fact that under the legislation there's going to be a new statutory body, the Assisted Human Reproduction Regulatory Authority. I don't think it's a statutory body that will need to be staffed by vast numbers of people, but it is a statutory body that will perform an extremely important function. For instance, I'm sure there are people around the world who may want to come to Ireland or may even be in Ireland who are not providing the level of service that is required in respect of assisted human reproduction. And I welcome the fact, Minister, that under Section 116, the Minister, you can now declare whether persons are fit or not to be involved in this particular business. Many members of the House have spoken about ethical issues that have arisen, and obviously ethical issues do arise when it comes to what is to happen in respect of embryos. On the issue of assisted human reproduction, if there's in vitro fertilization, embryos in general are implanted in the mother, and the hope is that the baby then is subsequently born. However, in very many instances, a number of embryos are produced and they are not all implanted. It is extremely important that those embryos aren't used for research unbeknownst to the parents, or research that we in this House would regard as unethical or inappropriate. I welcome the fact, Minister, that when you look at Schedule 2 of the legislation, that it sets out the types of behaviour that this House regards as being unacceptable. Experimentation in respect of embryos is something that we don't want to see in Ireland, and I think Schedule 2 has been very well drafted to ensure that that occurs. I also welcome the fact that in Schedule 2 that there's the provision available to the Minister for Health to enact by regulation other types of practices which may happen in the future in respect of experimentation on embryos. Then there is the issue of research. It's referred to as ESC research, and that's research on embryos, stem cells research. And in Part 3 of the legislation, that is dealt with. And it appears to be the case, and Minister, perhaps you could deal with this, maybe not in reply, but maybe at committee stage, it appears to be the case that under Section 30 of the bill, that research is permitted on an embryo when the intending parents consent to that research happening. Obviously, the research must be ethical. It can't be beyond what's provided for in Schedule 2. It can't engage in any of those types of activities. Obviously, Part 4 also deals with the storage of gametes and embryos. There's also a very interesting provision contained in Section 38, where you can have the tragic situation where a girl of 16 years of age may have to go under treatment for cancer, and in those circumstances, there's a provision contained within Section 38 which would allow for eggs from that child to be stored until after the treatment, in the hope that they will be of use to her subsequently in her life. I suppose the one issue that many people in the House have spoken about is the issue that's dealt with in Part 7, which is domestic surrogacy. And I think we need to be realistic about the extent of domestic surrogacy that will happen in Ireland. I suspect it will be extremely small. Unlike the whole area of assisted human reproduction and in vitro fertilisation, where there are very many people who avail of that service, I think in respect of domestic surrogacy, Minister, there'll be very few people who in practical terms will avail of it. We saw in the case of MR against Antord Clorahor a number of years ago a very good example of the type of domestic surrogacy that may arise. It's referred to as compassionate surrogacy. It was a situation where a woman was incapable of carrying a child to fruition. However, her sister was prepared to assist her, and the embryo that was created by the woman and her husband was implanted in her sister. The child was born. There was a controversy about it legally because the woman who gives birth to the child is regarded as being the mother. That is not the type of surrogacy that is very common in Ireland at present. I think we need to be realistic as to the type of surrogacy that happens in Ireland at present. And in general, it involves people from Ireland who are desperate to have children, going abroad to other countries where surrogacy is legal, having a child out there. One of the parents is usually providing one of the gametes. Then the other parent generally will apply for a step-parent adoption form out there, and they bring it back here, and there's an application brought before the adoption authority for the recognition of a foreign adoption. That's how it happens in Ireland, and I don't think we should fool ourselves into thinking it happens any other way. But I do think what we don't want to happen is to have two avenues of surrogacy in Ireland. One piece of legislation that will deal with domestic surrogacy, and another piece of legislation that's going to deal with international surrogacy. I think we need a mechanism where we have a statutory authority, maybe it's the one established in this legislation, that will deal with all types of surrogacy. And on the issue of surrogacy, I think we need to recognise it happens. And no matter what legislation probably we enact, it's still going to continue to happen. But as Deputy Connolly said, I think very important issue that may not be given enough recognition is the right to identity of the child subsequently born. Thanks very much, Carla.